Humanity Matters.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Legacy Chronicles here on HMTV. My name is Zachary Graulich and I am the Director of Education here at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center of Nassau County. Today I am joined by Dr. Ettie Zilber, a second-generation Holocaust survivor, author, educator, and public speaker. Ettie, thank you so much for being here today.
It's my pleasure, Zach. It's great to see you again, and I'm honored to be on your podcast.
Well, thank you so much. And it's a privilege to get to speak with you again. We've done events together here at HMTC in the past, so it's really nice to be able to have this podcast together and this platform for you to share with an even wider audience this time a little bit more about yourself, your work, your family history, and why you do what you do, which is just so incredible. I can't wait to share with all of our listeners you and your experiences and the wisdom that you have from working as an educator really across the world, speaking to so many different audiences. So to share first and foremost with our audiences a bit more about you, it's obviously imperative to the story that you are a child of Holocaust survivors. You were born in a displaced persons camp in Landsberg, Germany, to Lithuanian parents who had both survived the Holocaust. So starting at that beginning, is it safe to say that you essentially always knew that you were the child of Holocaust survivors and you really understood what that meant? Or is that something that developed more so later in life as you got a bit older?
Basically started after my birth, and when I became old enough to understand, clearly, we immigrated to the United States. So I went through the whole boat trip with my parents. Not that I remember the boat trip, but we've got photographs of it. And ever since I can remember myself, I knew that I came from somewhere else, and not from America. And so that was always in the back of my mind. Clearly, we spoke Yiddish at home, so I was not part of the American English-speaking landscape until much, much later. And in my homes, in all of our homes, my parents hung photographs. We were very lucky. Most survivors don't have any photographs of family members that were murdered. But we were lucky because well, it's a story in and of itself, but we had photographs, and my mother always had them framed on the wall. And as long as I can remember myself, I would, look at the photos, and mom would say, well, this is your grandmother, and this is your grandfather, and this is your aunt, and this is your other aunt. And I would ask, where are they? And oh, they died in the war. And of course, at that age, that was all I needed to know. As I got older, of course, I started hearing more and more stories from my parents, and also from eavesdropping on my parents with their the green friends from Lithuania. And I would hear some stories that would raise many people's the hair on their arms. So yes, I've known about it pretty much since I was born.
And I know that you say that you feel that you've really been marked with a special responsibility as a second generation Holocaust survivor, or 2G, as many of us in the world of Holocaust education understand it, to carry the lessons forward and to share the history with essentially anybody willing to listen. When did this responsibility dawn on you? Is it something that you always felt pretty much as long as you can remember, or it really developed over time that you realized you had a responsibility to yourself and your family to speak openly about this?
It's a good question. The feeling of responsibility came much, much later in my life. Most immigrant kids or children of survivors, they want to be like everybody else. They don't want to be different. So you never really wanted to focus on your differences. And so, like any other kid, I wanted to be like everyone else. I didn't talk about being Jewish, and I knew who I was, but it wasn't something that I felt needed public attention. It wasn't until we interviewed my mother. We recorded her testimony, and this was already in the late 80s, 1980s. No, even later than that, sorry. I think it was the end of the 90s, where we realized that because our father died young of cancer, we never got his full story. And we didn't want to miss the boat at this opportunity. And it was lucky that we did it then because a few years later, my mother started to develop dementia, and it would have been impossible. So we recorded her stories, and I started transcribing them. Many people think that second generations, they know the whole story from start to finish. No, it's not true at all. We might know little snippets and anecdotes, but we never actually got the story from start to finish in any kind of chronology. And so I started transcribing the recording and putting it in chronological order because, she jumped around with her stories. And at the same time, I started researching everything she said with other resources and basically corroborating and triangulating her stories with the intent to learn more about everything she said. And once I did that and had an opportunity to confer with her, because I sent it to her, I said, "Tell me what you think. Is there anything missing, anything wrong, anything you want to delete?" And so we had this opportunity to communicate at that time. And so the result was a document, which I thought, okay, great, I'll leave that for my children and my grandchildren. But it sort of took on a life of its own. And after I retired, because I was working full time as international school director of schools in Barcelona and in China and in Guatemala. So after I retired, I had a lot more free time. And I said, okay, what am I going to do with all of this? And the idea just started to develop. And at one point, I decided to physically go to all the places my mother mentioned. But that wasn't until after she passed because she never would have agreed for me to go back to Lithuania or to Poland. And but I had to do it, and I did. And I kept a journal. So that became part of the story and the book. So it had a lot of different movements. And that's when I realized, I have to use the story and my skills as an educator to educate the public. And and that's what I've been doing since then.
Well, you touch on one of the points that I was actually planning on bringing up myself is that you have an entire career as an educator across the world. So you know the importance of education and the power of personal memoirs, stories, books, historical chronology. You understand the difference that it can make. And you reference the book, which is the product of years of research and writing, your own personal journeys and reflections. We have it here in the studio, a Holocaust memoir of love and resilience. So I wanted to actually ask you, did your experiences as an educator for, a lot of your life really shape this book and the eventual end product? Were you gearing it towards a specific audience as you were writing it, or was it just something that you felt generally just needed to be known for everybody?
It's sort of two separate entities. The book as an entity in and of itself, I wanted it to have the personal story, so it's the actual recording, the transcription of my mother's words in her words. So I wanted that there, but then it was also the research and the impact. I analyzed the impact on myself as a second generation being raised by parents who went through serious trauma. And so that was all part of the book. My experience as an educator came in because I wanted to go into classrooms and tell the story. And so that's where that educator experience came into play because I produced presentations which are extremely engaging to youth, but also to adults. And so now, over the last years, I've been speaking to kids from middle school through university to adult centers, senior centers, both in the United States and in other countries. So that's pretty much, what I'm doing. The book has become the book is actually used in some Holocaust education classes in Arizona. But the main thing for me was to physically get in front of audiences to tell the story of my parents' story within the micro. That story is the micro, and I'm teaching also about the macro, what was going on around them in Europe at the time. So it is actually a Holocaust lesson with a descendant standing in front of them. And I always show photos of my mother as she used to go into college, into high school classrooms and tell her story. But I lament the fact that she can no longer do it. She's no longer with us. And so I've taken up the mantle.
You touch on something that I think a lot of, as we call them here at HMTC, legacy speakers or descendants of survivors really have to struggle with in terms of speaking to students or adults for that matter, is you're not only speaking about your own family's history, but you have to essentially incorporate the broader history as well. You know, if you're going into a classroom or a community center, you can't assume that everybody in the room with you knows the history or understands how you get to that point whenever it is that the experiences and the depravity began for your family. Of course, as we know, for some people, the quote unquote Holocaust began in 1939. And for others in other parts of Europe, it began in 1940, 1941, as late as 1944. So it's a different experience for everybody who endured it. And you can't assume that they understand the history behind it. So for you having to manage that and then also incorporate your own family's experiences, I'm sure it's a challenge for you, but nonetheless rewarding, I would assume.
Yes, and you're right. An educator is an educator, and our skills that we've used in our career were perfectly suited to this. So I know exactly how to introduce, how to keep them going with me as I'm telling the story, because I'm a pretty good storyteller. And I also have a lot of visuals. That's another thing that kids, not only kids, adults as well, but I have visuals. It's not just lines on the screen. It's visuals. And well, I guess you could say fortunate that my parents' ghetto was one of only two ghettos in Europe that has actual footage, photographs that were taken illegally, at the time, um, by a photographer who was also incarcerated in the ghetto. And so I have 3 years of his photographs that I use in my presentation. So the kids can actually see pictures of the ghetto and pictures of what happened in the ghetto and the people in the ghetto and what they were wearing and what kind of little wooden houses they lived in. And so it's much easier for them to really get a picture of what is a ghetto, and that's important. And that's important. And I also did a lot of research and got archival footage from the Nazis themselves, and I show that to them. And I also teach them a lesson as I'm showing them these photos because I'm explaining that whenever you see a photo, you must always ask who took the photo and why did they take the photo? And, and then I teach them, I said, well, it's getting a little difficult now to really differentiate between a real photo and a doctored photo or a created photo through AI. And I have a certain way that I teach them that, and it is going to be very complicated for us now, but they get it, and so I show them archival footage from the Nazi collection itself, and they understand why they took those photos, and then why in the Kovno Ghetto, Tzvi Kadushin or George Kadish, his Americanized name, why did he risk his life taking these photos? And they get that very, very clearly. So it's a lesson in a lot of things that can actually be related to current times.
Yeah, it's a really great point to make is that so much of the struggle in terms of teaching the Holocaust is that overwhelmingly the documentation and the photographs that do exist were perpetrator driven or perpetrator created. It was the Nazis documenting their own atrocities for purposes of pride, pleasure, exhibition in the future. And you
And
have to
propaganda, and propaganda.
Absolutely. And it's important to recognize that and also recognize why, as you said, so many of the ghettos, there are no photographs of them or video footage for that matter. We have a couple of survivors here in our center that actively speak, and they both just so happen to be in the same ghetto, the Matazalka ghetto in Hungary. And there are no pictures online of that ghetto. So they stand in front of the students and they're trying to explain what that ghetto was like. And of course, you can all do your best to imagine, but it will never do it justice in any true way. And the fact that there is not a single photograph of that ghetto, it makes it challenging for students and adults to conceptualize. So it's important, and it's an important point that you make that you, as you said, are relatively fortunate in that sense that you were able to have not only family photos, but also pictures and video footage that can accompany what your parents endured and experienced. So it's a benefit you have.
I actually have two photos of one of my grandfathers, two of them, from the ghetto in that collection. And that I doubt whether there are too many people that have that. The only other ghetto that had photos was the Łódź ghetto in Poland. And you're right. It makes a huge difference to the kids or to any audience to see actual photos from the time. And plus, we also had, she later became a famous artist, and she drew drawings of ghetto life and ghetto people. And most of her drawings were destroyed, but right after the war, she immigrated to Israel. She recreated all of those drawings. So I grew up with those drawings in the house. And my parents had a collection of her drawings. So from the youngest age, I knew what the ghetto looked like.
And you mentioned the fact that you have photographs of your family members, including those who did not survive. And as you mentioned, that is something that is rare, to say the least, amongst descendants of Holocaust survivors. The vast majority were not able to have any photographs survive. People were lucky if maybe something was sent over to family in the United States before the Holocaust. For me personally, I have family photographs that is the only reason why they exist, is they happen to be sent over beforehand. And, that's essentially all that we have that exists in terms of documentation on those individuals who were later murdered by the Nazis and their collaborators. So it makes an overwhelming difference. And I'd love to ask you, what is the difference that you have seen in terms of the reactions from whether it be students, teachers, adult audiences? What are some of the comments that you get, or the reactions or the questions that they ask you afterwards? What is it that you see yourself as a presenter that lets you know you're making a difference and you're making an impact?
Every teacher knows exactly through the eyes of their students where their head's at. And that's just something that you develop, that skill. You know when the kid is getting it, you know? You know when the kid is confused, doesn't understand. You know when the kid is emotionally affected by whatever you do. And so when I give a talk, I never stand still. I'm always all over the room. I'm walking, I'm looking in at every single person as I'm talking, as if I'm speaking to them personally. And I look into their eyes and I see their faces. And so that's one gauge for me. I will see tears, I will see kids getting visibly shaken up. And and I can see almost like the wheels turning in their head, that they're really grappling with something, and that's one way that I see it. Now I must differentiate between the different kinds of audiences I have. Uh, I go into schools where maybe they read Anne Frank in English class, and that's pretty much all they know about the Holocaust. Maybe the teacher taught them a little bit more about the Holocaust than just about the Anne Frank book that they're reading, right? The journal. But then I also go into classes that are actually Holocaust history classes or Holocaust literature classes. And there are some classes like that in Arizona. These kids chose to be in that class, and it is a whole different world when I speak to them. Then I go into classes where they've actually read my book, which is a whole other story, and they come already prepared with questions of what was your mother do like, and what was she doing, and what did she think, and so on. So every single audience is different. My adult audiences, particularly the seniors, many of them were, if they're old enough, they might have actually served, and if not, they're children of perhaps liberators who never wanted to talk about what they saw in Europe. And these people are riveted, absolutely riveted. And of course, they have stories, perhaps some of them might have stories from their own parents. So every audience is different. But as I said, I can see from their faces and their eyes um, their emotional attachment to the subject and their understanding, and by their questions. Yes, they do ask. I answer a lot of questions, and from those questions, I can understand where they're coming from. And so that for me is the best part, because you write a book and somebody reads it, you don't necessarily get any feedback. But when you're in front of an audience and they're listening to you, and my claim to fame is no high school kid fell asleep in my presentations. And you know that you've captured them emotionally and cognitively. They have learned something. And as we know, when somebody learns something and becomes emotionally attached to the topic, they will always, always remember it. And so that I think is a bit of how I gauge my audiences.
It's a great point because you have to make them feel and understand at the same time. And you don't want to overwhelm them because, as you said, so many of the audiences may not have been properly prepared, if prepared at all. And you have to, again, you have to set the stage, like we talked about, for the history before you could even really mention your family and what your parents endured. And, that's part of this education as a whole, and being a teacher is setting that stage beforehand, and your passion for Holocaust education as a whole, not just regarding your parents' experiences, but just in general, clearly has to shine through all of your public speaking engagements. And it's worth mentioning that from what you've shared with me, you've also worked with interviewing other survivors. You have been a docent at the Arizona Jewish Historical Society Museum. So it's not just your family's experiences that you're sharing, but you're really working to promote the history and lessons of the Holocaust in general. So what is it that drives you and motivates you to do this work pretty much day in and day out? I know firsthand from our experiences together in the past, you have such passion for this field. Where does it come from, aside from, of course, your family connection? Or maybe that is fully what drives it. I mean, in your own words, what is it that motivates you to keep going?
Yeah, all of the above and more. Certainly the family story. First, for me to learn the family story and to put my head into their heads at the time. Sadly, I would have to say that the last number of years, this has jumped up at me to me in a very palpable way, where I see so many similarities between the 30s and now. And that scares me. That scares me. And for me to go into audiences, I don't talk about politics, current politics, or anything, but what I do is debunk this myth. First of all, that Holocaust means gas chambers. All right. If they know anything about the Holocaust, and sadly, the majority of millennials do not, but if they do, then maybe they've heard of Auschwitz, maybe, and maybe they've heard of a concentration camp, gas chamber, crematorium, maybe. And that's their entire picture of the Holocaust. And so I emphasize the fact that Jews went through all sorts of different experiences during the Holocaust. Some of them were murdered, never leaving their town. And my family story is a very, very good example of that. The massacre started before the Nazis even got organized in town. So I wanted to debunk the myth that it was only concentration camps, because there was so much more, like the Holocaust by bullets, which was Eastern Europe. That was how the Eastern European Holocaust began. And so this is very important. And the passion, so yes, family. The passion is for me to understand. I don't think there is a single person who can sit down and say, how how did one man manage to influence so many people to think and believe that right is wrong and wrong is right? That's the question. That's the question. And it was almost impossible for people to understand it. So many say, oh, well, the Holocaust happened because of hate. Yeah, because of age-old hate of anti-Semitism. Yes, certainly there was the anti-Semitism to as the foundation there, but somebody gave license to the ability, the legality of murdering Jews. That came from above. That didn't come from below. And as soon as and I teach the kids about a world upside down. How can you imagine a world upside down? Well, where wrong is right and right is wrong. We all know what's right and what's wrong. We're taught. We're taught from age 0 what's right and wrong. How are all these people convinced that right became wrong and wrong became right? That's my goal. And I have become even more passionate about it in the last few years, seeing how should I say it diplomatically? How people have been convinced of a false narrative. And that to me is frightening. So maybe that fuels my more recent passion.
It's a really complicated and challenging concept to try to address is how did it happen? How is it possible? And people have spent decades of their careers studying it, researching it, and attempting to articulate into words how it was possible, why did it happen, how did it happen, and deviating a little bit for a moment, there's this emerging, let's say, concept of really the Nazi German society essentially being this criminal state in and of itself, that when you view it as this criminal state, whereas every law, every action, as you said, right became wrong, wrong became right, you can attempt to conceptualize what does that do to a society? What does that do to a population? And how does that permit, from a legal standpoint, people to take action that in a quote unquote normal democratic society would never happen, right? Take actions that they would never even consider in everyday life. So you have to consider the society as a whole. And as I said, it's this emerging idea of Nazi Germany essentially being this criminal state as it is now being considered by many historians and scholars. So it's an incredibly fascinating topic.
Yeah, and it would be erroneous, it would be a mistake to think that it was only the Germans. They succeeded in convincing an entire continent to do this. The Holocaust could never have been accomplished, never, just by the Germans. Never.
Absolutely.
And that's what people, it's not to exculpate the Germans, they've got their blame there. But how were they able to conquer a continent and convince the local people? Now, yes, you can argue they were terrorized into it. Yes, that's what happens in a reign of terror. And people behave the same exact way when they are afraid. When they are terrorized, they act the same way. And people choose to collaborate. People choose to keep their heads down and just stay away from the conflict. And people choose to go with the flow. And don't forget, according to Father Patrick Dubois, who's the one who coined the phrase Holocaust by bullets and has researched that entire period of history, everybody gained something by the Holocaust. Not the Jews, right? But everybody else had something to gain. And so I teach the kids the Holocaust was not only the biggest genocide in history, and of course that term didn't exist until afterwards. It was also the biggest robbery in history, from underwear and shoes and boots all the way to real estate, artwork, et cetera, et cetera. So everybody gained something by collaborating. And that's human nature, unfortunately. And people say history repeats itself. No, history doesn't repeat itself, but human nature does. And people behave the same way within the same circumstances. You give them an upside down society where right becomes wrong and wrong becomes right, and everybody's going to behave the same exact way as they did in the 30s and 40s and as they did in other periods of time in history. So I'll get off my soapbox.
No, it's another incredible point, and that's for me personally. When I give presentations or tours here at HMTC, I by and large refuse to omit the collaborators from the narrative because you can't. The Holocaust would not have been possible without them. So many people, just in everyday life, classrooms, teachers, authors, they may only say Nazi Germany, they may only say the Nazis or Hitler, but you're doing a disservice to the history, to the survivors, to the victims when you label it or characterize it as being solely the responsibility of the Nazis or even just one man in Adolf Hitler, right? It could not have been possible without all of the collaborators. But we digress. I do want to end on a more positive note than this. So I would love to ask you as we wrap up here, is there a message that when you speak to an audience, you try to impart upon them at the end? Of course, you want them to memorize everything that you say to them during your 45-minute or an hour-long presentation, but we know realistically as educators, that's not going to happen. So there are, I'm sure, key takeaways or one final thought that you leave with your audience that you really want them to go home with. So if there is such a message, I would love for you to share it with us here so that anybody listening to this episode will also leave this episode with that message.
I actually have more than one message, but one of the major points that I want to point out to my audience is the Holocaust didn't begin with gas chambers, and I show them the 12-year trajectory, officially the 12 years from the time Hitler came to power in 1933 till the end of the war in 1945. There's 12 years. It didn't start with concentration camps. It didn't start with gas chambers. And that's something that I want to make sure they understand. How did it start? It started by separating a particular group, targeting a particular group, creating all sorts of narratives about that group. It happened by controlling the media. It happened by making laws against that particular group. And I show them these steps. And I say it happened because good people ignored it or tried to keep their heads down, as I mentioned. But evil people, smart people, people who saw a good future had something to gain from it, they did what they did. And so I leave them with that thought of it didn't happen overnight. It absolutely did not. And the other thing that I leave them with, the Holocaust is not just a Jewish issue. It's an issue about humanity, about people, how people react. And that's why it's so important to study it. Some people think, well, if you teach about a Jewish story, well, why don't you teach about equal opportunity to everybody else? That's not the point. This isn't a political issue. You learn so much from this particular story, and you can then use that to hopefully create a more responsible and empathetic and ethical citizenry in a democracy. And so that I would say were, some of the main points that I get across in my presentations.
Very, very well said. Well, Ettie, it was a pleasure as always. Thank you so much for joining us today for this episode. It's really been a lovely time together getting to speak and having you share with all of our listeners more about yourself, your experiences, and your families as well. So the last question I have for you is, for anybody who's interested, where may they get a copy of your memoir?
Oh, it's available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and if your audience reads it, I would love to have them write a review and give me a rating, and or even contact me directly if you have any questions. I love to answer readers' questions.
Great. Well, thank you again, Ettie, for joining us today. It's really been a pleasure. So thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you for the opportunity.
Of course. And to all of our listeners, thank you as always for tuning in for another episode of Legacy Chronicles here on HMTV. We will catch you next time.
If you enjoyed exploring the information, history, and stories in today's conversation, be sure to check out our other podcasts here on HMTV. Please subscribe, share, and stay connected for more engaging conversations.
Humanity